Welcome all to our latest event in Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Week. On behalf of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Program, Hillel at FIU and the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU, it's my pleasure to welcome you once again to FIU's 7th Annual Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Week, Day 3. I'm Oren Steer, Professor of Religious Studies and Director of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Program at FIU. And I'll be introducing and moderating today's event, a discussion of the new film by Sergei Loznitsa, Babiyar Context. Before I introduce today's panelists, I'd like to acknowledge and thank our co-sponsors, the FIU College of Communication, Architecture, and the Arts, FIU Department of Communication, and Students Supporting Israel. We are grateful for your contributions to and participation in this event. And now allow me to introduce our panelists. Ilan Sinelnikov is a speaker, a blogger, and a coach on the topics of Israel, campus advocacy, and grassroots activism, and is a relative of several Babiyar victims and survivors. He is the founder and president of the National Students Supporting Israel movement. Students Supporting Israel is a rapidly growing pro-Israel international campus movement that supports the state of Israel, founded at the University of Minnesota in early 2012 by Ilan and Valeria Chazin. It currently has multiple chapters across the US and Canada. Stuart Liebman is Professor Emeritus of Film Studies and Art History at the CUNY Graduate Center in New York City. He's lectured and published widely about films about the Holocaust, as well as various aspects of German, Russian, and East European cinema. In 2006, he was named as an Academy Film Scholar by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences Foundation in Hollywood. His edited anthology about Claude Lanzmann's Shoah was published in 2007 by Oxford University Press. And finally, Olga Gershenson is Professor of Judaic and Near Eastern Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she's also on the Film Studies faculty. A multidisciplinary scholar, her interests lie at the intersection of culture, history, and film. The author or editor of 3 books, she's an expert on Russian Israeli cinema and on Holocaust films from the Soviet Union. With that, we'll begin our discussion. Just one request that all attendees, please keep your microphones on mute. If you have any questions or comments for any of the panelists or for all of them, please put them in the chat and we will do our best to monitor them and get to them towards the end of the program as appropriate. I wanted to start with a slightly edited version of the film's promotional blurb, which reads as follows. On September 29th and 30th, 1941, Sonderkommando 4A of the Einsatzgruppe C, assisted by 2 battalions of the Police Regiment South and Ukrainian Auxiliary Police, and without any resistance from the local population, shot dead in the Babiyar ravine in the northwest of Kiev, 33,771 Jews over those 2 days. The film Babiyar Context reconstructs and visualizes the historical context of this tragedy entirely through archival footage, documenting the German occupation of Ukraine and the subsequent decade. When memory turns into oblivion, the promotional material reads, when the past overshadows the future, it is the voice of cinema that articulates the truth. Winner of the Golden Eye Award at the 2021 Cannes Film Festival and Best Documentary at Chicago and BFI London Film Festivals, Babiyar Context was a surprise hit at this year's Miami Jewish Film Festival. And it sold out its 2,000 allotted screenings, which was just a phenomenal showing for a challenging and difficult documentary with absolutely no, well, not absolutely, with very little diegetic, non-diegetic sound, very little commentary coming from outside the context of the film itself. So over the course of the next hour, I'd like to discuss with our panelists some of the salient points and innovations of Loznitsa's film. And I think I'd like to start with emphasizing one key word that comes out of the promotional blurb, and that is the word truth. The truth of the events of Babiyar. And I'd like to ask Ilan if he wouldn't mind starting us off, telling us a little bit about the background of the location and the events at Babiyar in the fall of 1941.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you everyone for having me. Babiyar is very personal to myself and to my family because we have lost 14 family members in Babiyar that were murdered there. The youngest one was just a few-month-old baby, and the oldest one was a grandmother at the age of 80 plus. And now with them, of course, over 30,000 Jews of the city of Kyiv were murdered by the Nazis in a matter of 3 days, which was the largest single-handed massacre in the Holocaust during the years of the Holocaust. They killed so many people in such a short period of time. Also something that now as the discussion, it has been 80 years since the Babiyar massacre, and we started finding out more and more information about it. And it's also becoming more of a conversation, because usually when we think about the Holocaust, we usually think about Poland and the concentration camps and Auschwitz and Dachau, but we don't really know that 3 million Jews were killed by bullets in Eastern Europe, and at least 50% of the Jews that were murdered during the Holocaust were not led to the gas chambers, but they were led to the ravens, and they were shot dead when the Nazis and their, in this case, Ukrainian collaborators were just standing above them, looking into their eyes and shooting them to death, and just keep bringing more people and shooting them to death as well. So what we know is that in September of 1941, as the Nazis started moving towards the city of Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine nowadays, and they ended up occupying the city, and they entered the city between the time frame in which they moved towards the city and occupied the city. About 100,000 Jews were able to escape Kyiv. One of them was my great-grandmother, Leah Estes, that escaped with her little son, and that's the only way why she stayed alive, while many other Jews, like Leah's father, did not leave the city for many reasons. A lot of elderly people couldn't evacuate. Also, a lot of elderly people, some of them were saying that, oh, we saw the Germans in the First World War, so it's okay, like they're not going to touch us. They couldn't believe that the Germans could do such a thing. And therefore, when the Germans finally captured the city, and it was only 2 army battalions, so it wasn't too many soldiers, you know, the Germans used a lot of help from the locals in order to kill so many Jews. They published a message in the city of Kyiv. And the message said that all the Jews, and they used a different word for Jews, a word a little bit less pretty, that live in Kyiv and its area must come at 8 a.m. on Monday, the 29th of September, 1941, in the intersection of the city of the streets Melankovsky and Doktrov, which is near the funeral houses. They need to take some papers, they need to take some money, a few clothing items, and every Jew that will not show up and will be found elsewhere will be shot. Every citizen or resident of the city of Kyiv that will try to also take over the apartments of the Jews, and again, they use different words for Jews, also will be shot. And that's how 30,000 Jews showed up on those mornings and kept showing up in the intersection, and they were led to Babiyar. I was just there in October of this year. I was at the anniversary of the event, so I had a chance to see exactly the intersection of where the Jewish community showed up, the route that they took towards Babiyar, where they were shot, and they just kept leading them hundreds after hundreds, and that's how we lost 14 family members in my family. And nowadays, of course, I can keep going, but I know that we also need to capture on some other moments. There'll be times for questions, but nowadays this is like events like today's and my arrival in Kyiv in October. I think it's our biggest victory that we can possibly have over the Nazis, because we're still here and the memory of the people that were murdered is still alive. So thank you, and this is a very short briefing about what took place.
Thank you, Ilan. Thank you for starting us off. So I'd like to move to Professor Gershenson and really ask if you, I know you have some clips that you've prepared, and I thought it might be helpful for the audience, particularly those who didn't get a chance to see the film, if you could perhaps share one of them and tell us a little bit about what we're going to see and how it fits into the film, and then maybe we can also get some commentary about that.
So thank you, Oren. Thank you, Ilan. I'm a film scholar, first and foremost, and when I'm looking at the films, especially a film like this, I'm thinking about questions of what scholars call representation, right? These horrendous events took place, unimaginable. And, you know, since then, the filmmakers, the writers, poets are grappling with how do you tell that story, right? The ultimate victims are not here to tell their story. We somehow need to do it. And, you know, and there are different answers to these questions, right? One of the interesting answers was given to us by Claude Lanzmann. I hope people here are familiar with his work, right? With this kind of monumental documentary film, Shore, that really established some of the visual language, some of the ways of thinking about it, as I'm sure Stuart Liebman will tell us later. And so what, if you guys remember, what Claude Lanzmann said is that his response to the question of how do we represent that kind of atrocity was, we just don't. We don't. We only talk about, we talk with survivors, we talk with witnesses, and even with perpetrators, right, which is even more complicated. And we only hear from them because the ultimate victims are just not there. All we can capture is the absence. And someone asked him, you know, but what if you had archival footage, you know, footage from, let us say, crematorium, or footage from some other, you know, horrendous site? And Lanzmann said that he wouldn't use it, that in fact it would be blasphemous to use it. So this is it. The reason I'm talking about it, because I think that there's a very interesting context for looking at Loznitsa's film, because Loznitsa, who is Claude Lanzmann, obviously filmmaker of different generation, French Jewish filmmaker, himself had kind of, you know, participated in the Second World War. Loznitsa is a person of a different generation, of different cultural backgrounds. So he's, you know, he grew up in Kiev. He's not Jewish. He's been exiled from kind of, you know, that area, like former Soviet Union. He lives in Germany. So he's a documentary filmmaker first and foremost, and he brings his very specific sensibility to that. So I think it would be interesting for us to ask that question, you know, how does Loznitsa come to that question of how do we represent atrocity? How do we represent the tragedy? And so to start us off, let us watch together a short clip from the film where he actually depicts that ravine, Babiyar, and in the middle of the film, and it's that clip starts right after that note that Ilan described, right? The note that orders Jews to come with the valuables to a particular point. So bear with me with the technology. You know, in rehearsal, it all worked well, but you know how that is, the famous last words. So yeah, Let's hope it works. So if you guys are watching and you would like to see the entire screen and you want to see the entire screen, you can just minimize that the panel where you can see our faces so that we don't block from anything from view. It's a short clip. So it's a difficult clip, like pretty much most of the film, but I wanted to open with the question to you, maybe to panelists who can unmute themselves, and to the audience who can respond in the chat. So tell me, what did you notice? What did you see? What did you hear? So maybe, so the panelists.
Why don't we invite Stuart to come in with the first comment to respond to the question, and then we can also make a round.
That would be great. Yeah. What did you see? What did you hear?
Yeah. Well, a series of color stills that described in the absence of the bodies themselves, the clothing of those who were killed, and various. I have questions about this sequence too, by the way.
Right.
And you see also large numbers of men, not German soldiers, who are there doing something about digging, and you see a peasant woman on the edge of the ravine, speaking calmly with a German soldier guarding. That's a rough précis of what you see. And you hear, and this is one of Loznitsa's favorite collaborators, Golovnitsky, who has inserted bird sounds and some wind sounds and things like that. This is his specialty, to create a sound montage that echoes. I just add that I do think that there's a quote from the famous Yevtushenko poem that reads as follows: "Here all things scream silently, and bearing my head, slowly I feel myself turning gray, and I myself am one massive, soundless scream above the thousand buried here." And in some way, I find the recourse to a kind of voiceless regard for this place as somehow an echo of the mood that Yevtushenko struck in 1961.
Mm-hmm. So, Stuart, obviously, is your comments are always so perceptive and so precise. So you described it in a kind of neutral language, right? We see this clothes, we see the woman comment, we see. So it's interesting. Maybe if we can continue this conversation. So what does it all mean though? Like what is Loznitsa saying with this? Why are we seeing steals? Where are these? Who's taking these steals? Who are these people in these steals? Why are there piles of clothes? Where are the victims? What actually? Why only the steals? Why not food? Like there are so many questions there. So I don't know if Stuart, if you want to continue.
I'll just say one thing, Oren. When I don't know, Oren, if it's still available, but your interview with Loznitsa was very instructive, and he actually mentions the name of the photographer. Somehow he knows. I don't. I couldn't catch it with his accent. But the question I had about it, and maybe this you share this, Olga, is exactly when this was shot, when these stills were shot. Was this in 1941? I don't think so. I don't think so. I think these were much later. And all those men you see, whether it be Russian POWs or Ukrainians assisting forced labor, I think it's after or just before the exhumations, and this is something that you don't, and burning of the bodies, that I think that's when they were taken. But they stand for, nevertheless, they represent the absent murdered as a sign of those who were victims.
Mm-hmm.
That's
I'm going to just jump in.
Yeah.
Just so first of all, yes. So for those of you who don't know, as at the invitation of the Miami Jewish Film Festival, I did interview director Loznitsa. The video is still out there. I just looked for it while Stuart mentioned it, and I posted the link to it in the chat. Please don't go watch it now, but after we're done, feel free. It's about an hour long, and Loznitsa is a great conversationalist. It's impossible to get him to stop. And he does mention it. I think the whole question of the provenance of the stills essentially is one of the essential questions of the film. And I just want to throw out again, to sharpen Olga's question and maybe invite Ilan to comment, is for those who haven't seen the film, it's a little bit of a bait and switch, right? I thought we were going to watch a film, moving picture, and all we've got are still pictures, right? And so what's going on here, as Olga said, right? And I think what's going on here speaks very, very powerfully to the limits of the availability of material for Loznitsa to use. So Olga, back in her earlier comment, made a contrast with Claude Lanzmann, and Lanzmann, who insisted on not using any archival footage for his epic documentary Shoah, and Loznitsa is almost the exact opposite. He only wants to use archival footage. And what does he do when faced with the problem of the killing site itself, the center, the climax of the entire film? Footage does not exist. And so all he can do is kind of paint a picture around it in this very evocative way with these slow, meditative shots of the stills. what I wanted to ask Elon to comment, because I know you come at this from a very personal perspective, and that scene, and particularly the scene of the clothing, of the prosthetic leg, the wallets, photographs, all just scattered. It is incredibly painful for anyone to watch this, and yet someone who has a personal connection to the events and to the site, it must be even more painful. I'm wondering, what was your reaction to this scene when you saw it?
Yeah, so actually, I was watching the film in Babiyar. So when I was in Kiev during the 80th anniversary of the events, our delegation was brought to Babiyar. And of course, there was many other delegations from Europe. We were the only delegation from the United States. And the mayor of Kiev spoke, and then they turned on the film. And it's nighttime, it's evening. I'm trying to even give you the perspective of what was going on through my mind when the lights are off. It's nighttime, it's chilly. October in Kiev, it's not necessarily the warmest time of the year already. And the film starts coming up, and as you said, Sandra, there's not a lot of words there. It's not like people are really speaking, and you see this footage, and you sit there, and I remember thinking to myself, at first, I was like, am I really sitting in Babiyar? Like, am I here, or like, where am I? And then the wind blows a little bit, and it's almost like goosebumps, and you see this footage, and you start kind of thinking to myself, literally 5 yards away, or like 15 yards away, that's where the people were shot. That's where thousands of Jews were shot just because they were Jewish, not for any other reason. So it was a very, very emotional moment for me. And I even felt a sense of, at first, when the film just started, I felt a sense of anger. Like I remember that I was just sitting there, and I was just so angry and mad about such a thing. I could not even imagine of how it's even possible to murder 30,000 people like in 3 days. It's not even possible how humans can do that. And clearly the people that were doing it were not humans. Then I was thinking to myself, I felt the anger turned into almost like misery almost. I felt it's like miserable. It's like, could it have been stopped? Why no one has stopped it? Or like, why people stood by, and why the locals helped and gave a hand and didn't try to save their neighbors. Because again, without the local cooperation, it would not be possible to kill so many Jews. And then the best part, and that's actually something very interesting, that as the film was developing, and we were already a good almost an hour into the film, there was footage, live footage of 3 prisoners of war speaking. And there was one of them was like speaking, and it said that American journalists arrived in Babiyar in 1943 to cover the events. And you see a person speaking on the screen, and I'm like, well, I know this guy. Like, I know this face. This face is very recognizable. And I'm thinking to myself, who can it be? Who can it be? And at Babiyar, I'm getting my phone out, and I go scroll through my pictures that I have, like family pictures that I keep about Babiyar and family members. And I see that this man is standing next to my great uncle, Leonid Ostrovsky. And he was one out of 12 prisoners of war that attempted an escape. More than 12 attempted an escape. 400 of them attempted to escape, and 12 of them actually survived. And they were standing at Babiyar, and the year is 1943, when the American journalists arrive, and one of them is speaking, and he's wearing the same clothing as in the picture. And when I see that, I honestly, even now when I'm talking about it, I'm getting emotional. I didn't know what to do with myself. Like, I was sitting on the spot, and I just didn't know what to do. I was like, I need to call my dad. Like, I can't call my dad because I'm in Babiyar and I don't have a cellular data right here. Like, it's the middle of thing. And I was so almost like lost, and it was closing a circle for me. I felt like I'm closing a circle, that I arrived in Babiyar, in the place where so many Jews were killed, as the president of an organization called Students Supporting Israel, representing a delegation of American and Jewish leaders from the United States. And when I walked out of that film and we got back to the hotel, I just like collapsed into bed, and just closed my eyes, and that was one of the toughest days I've had in many, many years. So that was the experience for me, and that's my reaction to it. And of course, I can share more, but I think I'll stop right here.
Wow, that's an amazing story. It really, I think it brings up something that I very much want us to talk about, and I'll ask Stuart and then Olga to comment. The film title itself has kind of an odd locution: Babiyar, period, context. And I want to ask you both. Ilan just gave us a sense of the context for his viewing the film and his own perspective on it, but I think Loznitsa had something very different in mind, and I'm wondering if you could comment on this idea of context.
Yes, I would say a couple of things. First of all, there has been in the last two and a half years or so another film about Babiyar by Boris Mavsir. And he takes quite seriously to heart Lanzmann's restrictions, constraints about Holocaust representation only through the voices of survivors who themselves witnessed something happen. And it's a very different context. What he does is to record these interviews following the path of the Germans' atrocities when they moved across the border in Poland, from Poland into Ukraine, and then eventually ended up in Kiev. And so that's a notion of context that is more microscopically historical, I would say. It attempts to give a history through the voices of survivors. As has already been pointed out, Loznitsa does something very different. And there are many, many different contexts, some of which he may or may not have had in mind. But one context that comes up right away for me is that this is, in some ways, an echo of a pattern that was established in the Soviet period. There were a number of accounts of atrocities at, for example, Drobitsky Yar, another place near Kharkov, now Kharkiv, and also at various other sites. And they would have a certain shape to the stories that they wanted to tell. It was essentially a story of crime and punishment. And we see that very much echoed in this film. You end with hangings that were fairly typical of the ending of these early Soviet documentaries until Stalin stopped it in the early mid-40s. But there's something I think more interesting about Loznitsa, because he is a very fine filmmaker and a very attentive filmmaker. And that is that this is, his notion of context is virtually abstract, more than historical. It's aesthetic as much as it is historical. And though there are references to key points of the story that he wants to tell, this crime and punishment story, and then ultimately the burial story at the end when they destroy memory by filling the ravine. That's the epilogue. But the basic story is told in absolute symmetry. There's almost a kind of classical balance. You follow the German army as it comes through. You see them take over ruined towns, kill people, watch the destroyed tanks, Russian tanks and so on the road. And then you come into towns, the local people salute the new owners of the town, the Germans, and then you watch as speeches are given and so on. Then, of course, there's Babiyar itself, and we briefly saw that, and I'll hold that for a minute. And then when the Russians attack, you see exactly the same progress in the same kind of shots. So everything is symmetrical around this central horrible event, and everything is balanced around it. Everything is broken. The occasion for emotion at any point is very, very real, as you see dead people and so on, or you see the Lviv pogrom, but it's broken by the kinds of black leader, sometimes with text, sometimes without, that just breaks and pauses emotion and induces reflection. And I think in general, that is what Loznitsa's contribution here is. It's not just simply that he uses archival footage, but that he uses archival footage in a very measured way so that reflection and a distance from the horror of the killing, epitomized ultimately by those stills, is in play at all times.
Yeah, very interesting. So I think that when I was thinking about this film, is that when he calls it, Babiyar, the context. I'm thinking actually about these stills that we watched together. This is the Babiyar, right? And everything else is the context. It's kind of, right, here are these epic events that are leading to it. And it's interesting how in the film, as you probably remembered from seeing it, he shows this remarkable, long shots with massive amount of people in them, with massive pictures of destruction. I've seen so many documentaries about the Second World War, what the Soviets used to call the Great Patriotic War. And a lot of these shots were new and striking and remarkable. I mean, he's really, he's kind of magician with this material. And it slowly converses onto these stills, and then and then this is the focal point, and then it goes from there, right? So this is almost right away after that scene. If we have time, Warren, we could watch another scene of, the American journalists come to the site, and it's 1943. And then there is one of the Soviet POVs who was forced to do this labor that Elon was talking about, is shown speaking. And that's kind of, they're very close, right, to that context, and then it grows further up until filling up the ravine with some kind of industrial waste and covering up the memory. So there is this kind of remarkable movement, right, that of history and memory that Loznitsa captures. And I think that, I want to say also that, he is, I think, in the same way in which Claude Lanzmann set a new touchstone for the way to represent the Holocaust, right? That he influenced so many, including, Boris Mavtser, who is, right, he's not a genius, he's doing God's labor, but he's not that kind of filmmaker. But Loznitsa is doing something that is in dialogue, I think, with Lanzmann. On the one hand, he only does, he also, first of all, both of them stay away completely from reenactments. So everything is quote unquote real. The only reenactment that Loznitsa allows to himself is the soundtrack. And if you watch the film closely, you hear snippets of dialogue, you hear a kind of ambient music that would be kind of diegetic, right? So it's an imagined diegetic music, but it's something that they would have heard there, or some other sounds and noises, that whatever. And he's doing reenactments, right? He's using like old cars to capture that noise if there is traffic, let's say. So he does do sound reenactments. And then in terms of his visual, it's remarkable because he succeeds to show us and not to show us. I don't know if you remember that I think he establishes a new practice of kind of showing the Holocaust without indulging in voyeurism, without inviting our scopophilia. That's a term for kind of enjoyment through the eyes, right? There is particularly striking series of images of a pogrom in Lviv when someone is capturing events that take place in the prison, when the Soviets retreat. There is NKVD, the secret police prison, where the Soviets hastily execute people. And now the archival footage captures the post-German invasion, locals coming in, discovering the corpses, and then starting to beat up and abuse in other ways Jews. Jews are blamed for these events, right? There is this famous myth of Žido-komuna, the association between Jews and communists. And at that point, Loznitsa does something remarkable. He is showing to us images of violence, but he's showing them fleetingly, including even nudity. Nudity is usually particularly, I think, cringy in Holocaust footage, and we see it in a lot of fiction films, right? The naked bodies in gas chambers that are just horrendous. So he shows, and he keeps intercutting it with these black leads, right, that Stuart mentioned. So he shows, he doesn't show. It's difficult to enjoy these images because of these constant black leads. We kept, Stuart said, reflection. I was also thinking of constant reminder of we are here in that act of watching it, of learning about it. But he's very careful to not tell a story in a kind of way that would be sweeping, right? Would be clear, would be enjoyable, right? He is, in some ways, I would probably juxtapose him not so much with Claude Lanzmann, who is also difficult watching, right? But maybe with Steven Spielberg, right? Mm-hmm. So it's stunning, but it's not beautiful. It's painful to watch. It's a labor.
Yeah, but he says specifically that he edits the entire Lviv footage is not shown. It's shown, as you say, in fleeting fragments, but also with the worst images elided, cut out. And that's a deliberate decision because he says it in various interviews that he does not want Holocaust representation to move from art to life. In other words, cross over that boundary where the violence becomes too graphic, too visceral, and he wants to kind of allude to it, but without full representation. I wanted to mention too, and Olga knows this better than anybody, namely that there was an effort early on by the Soviets beyond the documentary footage. There was a filmmaker named Mark Donskoy who actually made a film in 1945 about Babiyar, which was deeply personal to him as it was to Ilan, maybe even more so because he was a contemporary of it. And there he does show, he attempts to represent the event by stepping across that line and recreating it, performing it. And it becomes, according to our contemporary notions of what is appropriate Holocaust representation and what is not, that's changing all the time, but whatever we think now is that that's indiscreet, to put it mildly, and tactless. And there have to be better ways of representing mass murder. And perhaps the best way is not to do it at all.
And yet, I want to come back to something Stuart said, which it's an amazing way of understanding it. In the midst of the discussion of the aesthetics and the way that with archival footage and with only archival footage, he creates these visual metaphors, there is also a narrative, a very clear, stark narrative of crime and punishment, Stuart's words. And for me, as much as there is restraint in showing the violence of the Holocaust, there is no restraint in showing the hanging scene. And I bring this up for two reasons. One, to counterbalance this idea that it's completely restrained. Because I found that scene very disturbing, not because of the hanging only, but also because of the thousands and thousands of spectators. And I want to just put out there this issue of spectatorship, of voyeurism, of us watching the film, and also the people in the film who are watching, in the footage who are watching. And I also want to just mention in the chat, and I encourage, please, audience members, feel free to put comments and questions in the chat. Svetlana Ershov has written that, I'm not going to say the whole thing, but a real emotional response to the anger at Ukrainians who cooperated. And so there's this issue of collaboration, cooperation, spectatorship, watching, and I just wanted to throw that back to the panel in terms of how does Ložnica represent or not represent the roles played by those who are not the major actors in the film, not the Germans, not the Russians, not the Jews. How does that play out? Anyone can feel free to jump in.
I would say somewhat inadequately, to be very discreet. I think there were constraints on what he could do in a Ukraine today very much under threat, and also very much negotiating its own sense of its independence as a country and as a culture, tired of the playing second fiddle to the Russians all the time. I think, and my family's from Ukraine too, by the way, and I don't know that he could have been more forthcoming about what we all know to be a stain on the national honor of all the countries that had collaborating citizens. And this is, of course, a very sensitive moment in issue in Poland all the time. It comes up every day practically. But in Ukraine, they've yet to really integrate it into a full-fledged national discussion. And I don't think that he was in a position to make it more central. And it was a sideshow, frankly, compared to what the Germans were doing.
If I might add, actually, when I was on the ground in Kyiv, it was very interesting because as we were meeting with the Ukrainian officials, with the mayor of Kyiv, Klitschko, and with the foreign minister of Ukraine, and which is actually Jewish, I think his mother is Jewish. It was very interesting to see that the Ukrainian leaders, their number one phrase when they met the delegation of Jewish Americans, is that our number one priority, except Russia at the moment, it's the fight against anti-Semitism. We're doing everything we can to fight anti-Semitism, and it came at any conversation. This is what we're here for. We're putting up the museum in Kyiv right now to fight anti-Semitism. Like we have a Jewish president, and so on. And every time when they were asked about Babiyar and about collaborators and people that were on the ground there and did it, So everyone referred to them now not as Ukrainians, but as Soviets. They were the Soviet citizens. It was not the Ukrainians. We're like our nation, like 30 years old, but the collaborators and everything, it was the Soviets that were here, and they were kind of taking one step forward to recognize the importance of fighting anti-Semitism, and 2 steps backwards every time when the discussion came, and they're like, no, that's actually not us. This is the Soviets. And we all know that actually the Soviets and Ukrainian Soviets, everyone there, Babiyar, there was a lot of work done to cover it, to not talk about it. As Olga said, they were pouring concrete and throwing trash into that area in order to make sure to minimize of what happened in this area. I think right after the war, there was like a whole construction going on of pouring things, storage into the ravens and so on. And later on, there was like a little statue. I was in Ukraine and Kiev in 2005 with my family. I was a little bit younger. And the only thing I saw at Babiyar was like a little statue, like on the side of it, that said, oh, here in this place, like 30,000 Jews were killed. And nowadays, when we were in Babiyar, you go through the park, and while for us it was emotional and there was the ceremony, at the same time, you see in Babiyar people walking their dogs out, like students are like jogging, and like our person on the ground there that was helping us on the ground, he said like, yeah, people barbecue here all the time in the park. Like, so there was so much work that was done also to like minimize the events that took place there, let it be by the Soviets, and let it be nowadays with like the residents of the city of Kiev that see Babiyar as like another park in the city. And in the education books in Ukraine, there's like a little paragraph that talks about Babiyar. It's mandatory, but it's like a little thing that, yeah, like 30,000 Jews were killed. And then it always comes back to the discussion of, but on top of that, another 70,000 people were killed. So it's not just Jewish people, actually. So it was very interesting, the whole dynamic and how sensitive the conversation is, let it be for the victims and their families and their descendants, or let it be also for the Ukrainians nowadays that want to fight anti-Semitism on paper, but also very careful in taking ownership on what their ancestors did. So that's just another comment for the record.
Yeah, that actually brings up, I think this is probably going to be the final kind of question or comment that I want to put out there. And I want to give Stuart and Olga a chance to respond. This is really what we're left with at the end of the film. I mean, it's already been mentioned, the covering up of history and memory, just filling it in. I mean, it's a very, very powerful visual metaphor that this ravine we see so starkly in the kind of the promotional photo for the film. It's quite deep, and you can see, right, by looking at it, you can see how thousands could be murdered there, and then it all gets filled in. And I think what was especially difficult to watch was not just the filling in, but the building of what looks like an apartment house or a hotel. I don't know what it is right next to it, and just thinking, I mean, that's the ultimate sort of erasure of memory, that this becomes just a normalized place, right? With some sort of a plaque or a monument or something, it becomes normalized, and it becomes a very mundane, banal sort of debate over, well, what does a memorial look like? What does a monument look like? But the site itself is erased. The history of the site is erased. It's literally filled in. And this really is the metaphor for up to the present day, right? The struggle in Ukraine to kind of come to terms with the past, with Babiyar and the other events that happened there. So this is, I mean, you can respond to that or anything you like, but I'd like to hear from both Stuart and Olga. You can flip a coin, and this will probably be our last words.
Olga can speak.
So, I think that this is, first of all, the challenge of memory is a universal challenge at this point in the world. But going to the post-Soviet space, it does have its own peculiarities, right? So we mentioned that throughout the Soviet era, the memory of the Holocaust was pretty much silenced, right? Although the Soviets didn't kind of deny the Holocaust, they said, you know, sort of like everyone suffered, right? They were peaceful Soviet citizens, not necessarily Jews. So today, it's interesting that in the post-Soviet space, of course, in some ways, the picture has changed, right? There is a Holocaust Center in Moscow. There is a Babiyar Memorial Center, you know, with, as Ilan tells us, in Kiev, and there is a, you know, tremendous enterprise there, right, with Ilya Khzhanovsky at the helm. To create that kind of memorial center. Loznitsa himself is working on a fiction film about Babiyar. So there is like a lot of change. On the one hand, there is a lot of change. On the other hand, there is a lot that's remaining the same. So for instance, in Russian Federation, more so than in Ukraine, when there is a conversation about the Holocaust and Holocaust memory, predominantly the conversation is about, you know, over there in Germany, in Poland. So no one wants to talk about, you know, the Holocaust victims in Smolensk, which is, you know, Russian city where Jews were executed. So the same way in Ukraine, you know, Babi Yar turned into this iconic site, right? But of course, Ukrainian Jews were executed in literally like every town and shtetl where they lived. And that memorials are still not happening. And the little Holocaust museums that do exist, they're like kind of, you know, they're like in someone's room and they're not funded and they're not developed and no one knows about them. And so that, of course, is a real problem. And I think that it's the footage that Loznitsa is offering to us, specifically about Ukrainian collaborators, is remarkable. I mean, these scenes where people are, you know, in Ukrainian folk costumes are crowding to get, you know, a little swastika flag, or, you know, carefully attach a portrait of Hitler, very lovingly attaching it to some kind of vitrine. I mean, that's pretty powerful. I think that's, he really deserves a recognition for that, because I think it's, again, it's very easy to say, you know, those were the Soviets who did it. Those are not us. Or if it happened here, that's, you know, if that was not us, or if the Jews were killed, it's over there, you know, in Poland, in Germany, it's not here. So, you know, that I think is a remarkable accomplishment, because he creates this cinematic document that, you know, the Babi Yar as a physical ravine may be filled up with concrete, but once you see that footage, these images stay with you.
Thank you, Olga. Stuart, last word.
Well, as I say, I think that the parades of the young women all dressed in peasant costumes, the men riding horses and so on, with traditional hats and so on. I mean, clearly there was an embrace of the Nazis initially. Of course, later on at Babi Yar, many of these Ukrainian nationalists were killed by the same Germans. That's one of the ironies of all this. And then, of course, again, in this balanced structure that I perceive in the film, you have the same peasants not allowed really to, or not having the occasion to really dress up and so on, but greet the Soviets with the same enthusiasm after their several years of occupation by the Germans. It's one of the deeply ironic dimensions of the film that I see.
Thank you. Well, we've reached the end of our hour. So I want to just thank again our panelists, Ilan Sinelnikov, Stuart Liebman, and Olga Gershenson. I wanted to suggest that if any of the attendees would like to be in touch with any of the panelists, I'm sure they'd be happy to provide their email addresses in the chat, or you could always contact me or Hillel at FIU afterwards for their information. I want to thank as well our co-sponsors, the FIU College of Communication, Architecture, and the Arts, the FIU Department of Communication, and Students Supporting Israel. I'm also putting into the chat the link for the full Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Week program. The next event in our 7th annual HGAW is in only a couple of hours, and I'm in it. It's my big day today. It's titled On the Avenue, Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Week, and it's part of a regular series presented by FIU's 3 Washington Avenue-based arts outposts. In this case, addressing the ways in which the arts and museums create space to honor survivors and the memory of those lost during the Second World War. It begins at 7 p.m. Eastern this evening on Zoom, and you can get to the registration link through the full schedule that I've just posted in the chat. You can find a full list of events and Zoom registration links there. I'm going to admit a late person here, but I'm actually only going to do it just to sign off. And thank you all again for what has been an excellent and really stimulating conversation. And thank you again very much to our panelists, to our sponsors, and of course, to all of our attendees. Take care.
Thank you, Oren.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
See you, Olga. Bye-bye.